step in my face. Well, it's 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready. Now go, cat, go, but don't you step on my blue suede shoe. You can do anything but lay off of my blue suede shoe. Well, you can knock me down, step in my face, slander my name all over the place, and do anything that you wanna do. But honey, lay off of my shoes and don't you step on my blue suede shoe. You can do anything but lay off of my blue suede shoe. Oh, let's go, cat. My house, steal my car, drink my liquor from my old fruit jar, and do anything that you wanna do. But honey, lay off of them shoes and don't you step on my blue suede shoe. You can do anything but lay off of my blue suede shoe. Right.
I have music from 1958. Well, actually, 56.
For the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready. Now go, cat, go, but don't you step on my blue suede shoe. You can do anything but lay off of my blue suede shoe.
I don't know.
But it's blue suede shoe. Blue,
everybody thinks
blue suede shoe. Yeah, blue suede shoe, baby. Blue
I got to go to the next song.
You can do anything but lay off of my blue suede shoe.
So this is just some random thing on Spotify, but I picked 50s music.
Come on over, baby, whole lot of shaking going on. Yes, I say come on over, baby, baby, you can't go wrong.
YouTube hates this.
We ain't faking, whole lot of shaking going on. Well, I say come on over, baby, we got chicken in the corner.
Oh, Eddie Cochran's
Huh?
too. Well, we could keep going on that, but we probably do have to learn something. Oh, let's hear a little bit of Eddie Cochran, the great Eddie Cochran. We got 21 in the song. We gotta go. All right, just play a little bit of music. I should do that more often. The only problem is, I agree, it's awesome. I love Jerry Lee Lewis. These are all popular songs in the late 1950s. And maybe we'll have a musical interlude. Yeah, this is the one I really like. Come on, everybody. Let's see if it works. Okay, I like Eddie Cochran. I like a lot of musicians. Here we go. Let's hear more. I'm with you.
Everybody, let's get together tonight.
Good tune. Okay, so late 1950s music. I will do that for the rest of the year. I gotta start playing more music. We'll see how YouTube reacts. They might get annoyed. This is Rockabilly Mania. Rockabilly was a little bit of country, and what country they called hillbilly music back then, and rhythm and blues. In many ways, this is you combine this rhythm and blues, and it's rock and roll. You combine that with swing, they called it boogie woogie. Let's get to... Okay, as we all know, first off, this isn't working, is it? I forgot to change it again. Act like I meant to do this. Why isn't this working? Just give me a sec. I had it set up for special topics. I can play a little bit of music. All right, here we go. That's much better. So my assumption is everything is working now. Good. All right, so a couple things. First off, I told you about yesterday, just the end of the period, Joseph Stalin died. Santa Claus is arguably totalitarian. A little 1984-ish there. And talked about Hungary, the Suez crisis, but the biggies, Iran and Guatemala, were two examples of the United States actually violating the law. But that became the policy to overthrow democracies, all in the name of democracy. But let's be clear about it. Yes, it's anti-communism, but when Mossadegh nationalized the oil in Iran, well, the U.S. wanted its peace, and that would lead to a horrible, corrupt dictator, and the effects called blowback are with us to this day. I'm going to have, like I said, a very easy little quiz. I'm planning on Friday. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to issue it Friday and just have it run through the weekend through Monday or Tuesday, and you just get it done when you get a chance. I'm going to try to make it very basic. And remind me, maybe we'll do another musical interlude. I'm checking the YouTube thing and see if all of a sudden they go, no, you're off. Okay, so. Okay, the Santa Claus cartoon makes me laugh. And also talked about the blowback from Guatemala, the Arbenz government, United Fruit. And this shows how the complexities of the Cold War, Pac Mania, what an amazing time. But Stalin did die. And there was a power struggle. A troika was created, and eventually out of it would come somebody who a lot of people thought was kind of a joke, but a very intelligent man. In fact, he led the political battle in Stalingrad. He was basically in a sewer in Stalingrad fighting the Germans in 1942-43. Nikita Khrushchev. And you'll also notice that almost immediately there was a vast shortage of H's all over the world whenever they spelled Khrushchev's name. But Khrushchev, he was a former crony of Stalin. He was part of his inner circle in a way, even though other people thought would have more power, but an intelligent could maneuver very intelligently in this very political, cutthroat world. Shocking, it's cutthroat with Stalin. But his desire was to make the Soviet Union work. Has everyone got that? To make it work. He thought this socialist experiment could work, yet Stalin had taken them in a different direction to this horrible totalitarian terror state. And so what he wanted to do is to show the superiority of the Soviet way of life. Collective industry, collective farms, everything owned by the people, aka the government. And even though there were a lot of inefficiencies, he thought the inefficiencies were because of Stalin and the arms race. So his goal was to show that the Soviet Union is strong and therefore can negotiate a peace agreement. So he wanted to negotiate from a position of strength. Here he is bashing the United States, and he brought it in the United Nations. He was bashing the United States over a couple different things, but especially, we'll get to it in a second, U2 and Cuba. But he brought a shoe. Yeah, he brought a shoe. And he beat the shoe on the podium, which is a very Russian thing to do. And a lot of people thought he took off a shoe. No, he just kept it in his pocket. But Khrushchev would denounce Stalin. And in 1959, there were over 1 million statues of Stalin around the Soviet Union and the areas the Soviet Union liberated, and virtually all of them were taken down. If you go to these places under former Soviet control, and I've been a few times, in East Germany and Poland and what is now Czechia, but then Czechoslovakia, there are virtually no statues of Stalin. They took them all down. I told you yesterday how they buried the body 20 feet under, and he's coming back. But how's that for a startling moment? So the first thing you want to do is to prove the superiority was in the space race. And the space race was really seen as a very prestigious example of technology, but also of the arms race. And we'll get to that, I think, but you already know. And in 1957, shocking everybody, the Soviets launched the first satellite, had the first rocket to get a man-made body into space and in orbit, a very low orbit, eventually degrade and tumble back in the atmosphere. They call it Sputnik, fellow traveler. And you notice there's a picture Actually, it's a mock-up, but they're acting like they're working on Sputnik for the publicity photo. It's not much bigger than a basketball. And yes, if we would have had dress-up day for extra credit, I've had people dress up as Sputnik. I think it's amazing. But Sputnik, this little satellite, went around the world, and this was a massive leap because everyone thought the Soviets were big and clunky. Yes, they were brave as they showed in World War II, but they were way behind scientifically. And why did it turn? Sometimes it just does that. But this shocked the world. And the orbit was so low, you could see the satellite all over the United States as it went around the globe. Now, I know sometimes you can see satellites now, but the satellites are a lot higher. This was low, and it broadcast through a shortwave radio until the battery ran out. Just a beep. Just beep, beep, and beep. And people could hear it on the shortwave radio. So like the Soviets are right above our head. And this, well, this was quite a shock. Ike totally underestimated the United States. He did not realize that this is going to lead to panic. And he made this big deal at first. Congratulations to the Soviet Union, but the United States is way ahead in rocket technology. Well, who would believe that the United States is ahead if the Soviets already got a rocket up in space? I should add, the United States was ahead, but they were having some issues with the size of the rocket. But the US was ahead, but nobody believed it. But the panic really gets to this idea, first off, that the communists are winning. And there was this feeling in the 1950s with the Red Scare and with Korea and Hungary and that the Soviets were winning victory after victory after victory. Now, looking back in hindsight, this is ridiculous, but people believed it. And people would believe it that the Soviets were winning the Cold War all the way to all of a sudden the Soviet Union collapsed. Which, by the way, that's what Khrushchev was trying to avoid. But the big thing is, if they could put a satellite overhead so no longer are we safe in our own skies, that means they have a rocket big enough they can put a nuclear weapon on it, go over to the Arctic Ocean, or over the Arctic Ocean, hit the United States with no warning, and give the Soviets a huge advantage. This was a major victory in the propaganda war for the Soviet Union. By the way, I should add, just as the Republicans bashed the Democrats for losing China, now the Democrats would turn around and say, look what the Republicans did. They allowed the Soviets to get this weapon. So here you can see this, a Russian victory. And it was very illusionary, but people believed it. There's a Soviet poster. I love all the Soviet posters, space posters. They're great. I look at this site called Soviet Visuals. It's hilarious. And Eisenhower then, when he realized the panic, came out and said, the Navy team has a rocket ready to launch a satellite on their own. Now, the Army and Navy were both working on rockets separately in competition with each other. And so he picked one, the Navy team. Nobody was more surprised by that announcement than the Navy team. They were not ready at all. They knew they were behind. The Army team was actually way ahead. And for reasons, I think, you've seen a lot of things, and I've read different examples, and I've come to believe this is basically, Eisenhower didn't want to look like he was favoring the Army because he was an Army general. But the Navy team, and you can guess what happened to the Navy rocket. Oh, I should add, this also led to amazing technological designs from the Soviet Union, showing how they're ahead. Here is a train that had jet engines attached to the top, and here is a propeller-driven car. Yes, the Soviets were clearly ahead. Okay, that just struck me as funny. That is the Navy rocket called Vanguard. And what Vanguard did is, it went up about 3 feet and boom, exploded, and now the Soviets are way ahead. This made the United States look like idiots because they hurried this rocket. All its flaws came out at once. And you can imagine the headlines, oh, what a flopnik, kaputnik, all these kind of jokes at the United States, and now we're even further behind. And the thing is, in reality, the United States was ahead, but nobody believed it. And so, with that, the Soviets are winning, and just imagine the letters ING are behind that. So the Soviets are winning the Cold War, and that's what it looked like. A couple cartoons. Here's U.S. complacency right here, and our technical superiority will triumph in the, oh, there's Sputnik, what's that? And you notice the guys are laying back. Here's another one, wonder why we're not keeping pace. There's Russian science, And here's U.S. science, government secrecy, and U.S. education lag. So the U.S. is now behind. And this is going to lead to a couple big things. First off, the creation of one body to look into space research, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. So combine the Army and Navy teams. And this is where I'd probably make the Space Force crack, but I'm not going to do it. I just did, didn't I? And so NASA was created to coordinate this. And because the Army team was ahead, but the Navy had some adaptations. And by the way, it kind of makes sense. The Army is thinking ballistic missiles. The Navy is thinking ship-to-ship missiles. You might think, what about the Air Force? Well, the Air Force was so focused on heavy bombers that they were getting all the nuclear weapons anyways. But it also began the United States for the first time having public aid to education. Federal government aid, I'm sorry. Federal government aid. And the big thing was science and math to try to catch up with the Soviets. And this will have good effects and bad effects. The United States does not give a lot of money on the federal level to education. And that's a huge concern now. Most of it still state and local. And that's part of the reason why you pay such high prices for college. So that's something the United States has never committed a lot to education for young people, at least outside of K through 12. But for the first time, there was no real science, any kind of aid for science. Everybody was scared to touch science after the Scopes monkey trial. But after this, the realization of science, and now you see a big backlash against science education and with the conservative revival in the 1970s. So, Ike, back to Eisenhower. Eisenhower and Khrushchev actually had common goals. Despite all the bombastic talk in the arms race and blowing up nuclear weapons all over, Ike wanted his legacy to be that of a peacemaker, the general who brought peace. That's why he wanted to cut back on defense spending, because he believed defense spending was a waste, which the United States, who spends more than the top 10 other countries in the world combined, we are just pouring money into defense more than ever before now. But back to this. So he wanted a peacemaker. And so the general who brought peace. Khrushchev wanted the same thing. The arms race was a terrible drain on the Soviet economy. If he's going to make this thing work, he's got to end the arms race. And so tensions were actually lessening dramatically fast at the time where the Red Scare was still going on. Yes, McCarthy was gone and dead by then. His liver exploded from alcohol abuse, but it still was happening. So in 1959, Khrushchev made a trip to the United Nations. It was going to be a trip to the UN and then a couple days in New York. He ended up spending 2 weeks in the United States, surprising everybody, and did a tour across the U.S. where he did things like, well, he worked on a farm and all that kind of stuff in the Ukraine. And so here he is visiting an American cow, and eventually he would end up on the soundstage of The Wonderful World of Disney. And it's actually one of the great stories of him going to Disneyland and actually having a debate with Richard Nixon, who was the vice president, about the superiorities of systems. It's an amazing thing. I mean, it really seemed like, wow, the arms race might be over. And what a time. And in 1960, Eisenhower and Khrushchev were going to have a summit in Paris to have real arms control focusing on nuclear weapons. Thus, the peacemaker, but also fit in Khrushchev's goals of alleviating the arms race because it is such a drain on the Soviet economy. He believed, and it would turn out to be correctly, that the arms race will destroy the Soviet economy because it would take away so much expenditure from consumer goods and consumer goods and food, basic elements. That the Soviet Union would have greater and greater shortages, and that would crush them. He was right, and that's why I want to end that. But part of the reason Eisenhower thought that we could have an arms race is because he knew something that very few people outside of the brand new CIA and a few people in the Defense Department and the National Security Council knew. Just a few things. The U.S. was actually much further ahead than the Cold War rhetoric allowed. The U.S. was further ahead in rockets, nuclear weapons, planes. And yes, the Soviets had a huge, vast land army, but the superiority was mitigated by other American advantages. And the reason why was a brand new top secret spy plane that very few people knew outside of just a few people in the Air Force and the CIA, the U-2. And the U-2 is by definition a code name. U means utility plane. And so it didn't tell people that the United States had a spy plane that was flagrantly violating international law by flying over the Soviet Union. The Soviets complained about this, but the US denied it, and these are top secret operations. On the edge of legality with the National Security Act, but you can imagine how the United States would just go nuts if the Soviet Union tried to do that to the US. And here's the U-2. So they're having these illegal spy flights, and Khrushchev was going nuts. If you look at the U-2, it looks like a big glider, has huge wings, and it can fly 450, 550 miles an hour. So fairly fast, but the big thing is it could get to 55 to 65,000 feet and fly above Soviet radar for thousands of miles, or not, sorry, Soviet radar could pick it up above Soviet air defenses. So the Soviets could pick it up on radar, but couldn't shoot it down. And all their fighter planes had a ceiling of about 45,000 feet, so they couldn't get up to shoot it down. And so its cameras could record almost very detailed shots of Soviet rocket building, missile defense, everything. And by the way, the cameras were so sensitive that by the end of the decade, of the 50s, at 65,000 feet, they could read license plate numbers on their cameras. That gives you an idea how sensitive it was. And they would fly out of bases like in Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, Japan, Okinawa. And Khrushchev would complain, US would deny it. And then it picked up that the United States was actually really far ahead, and the Soviets were much further behind in virtually everything, from technology to rocket building to nuclear weapons. Khrushchev, though, said, if you continue these flights, they said it through secret channels, I know you're denying it. And most people in the United States were like, oh, the Soviets are lying again. But if you continue these U-2 flights, the Paris summit's off. And Eisenhower agreed. And yet Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, came to him in 1960 and said, you know, there's a new Russian missile building program. We have to find out in Kazakhstan, right here, now an independent country. And that's where the Soviets did most of their testing, in the big desert there, with the idea being that they always want to launch to the east, so the Earth kind of rotates this way. And if it crashes into the desert. That's why the United States does it in Florida. They launch against the rotation of the Earth, and if it crashes in the ocean. But one more flight, and Eisenhower reluctantly agreed. One more flight that would fly out of Pakistan, over Kazakhstan, and eventually end up in Norway. That gives you an idea about the range of these things. Francis Gary Powers was a CIA pilot. He was in the Air Force, and still technically in the Air Force, but flying for the CIA, and they basically had to have a space suit. And that was a picture taken actually before this, before another mission. And the thing was, they were packing so many electronics that the first the first example of the U-2s were having trouble keeping their altitude. And as he was flying, he was having all kinds of trouble with his plane. He got up to about 50,000 feet, which he knew was, by then, barely over Soviet defenses. And he couldn't get the plane much higher. And then over Kazakhstan, the engines went out. And you know what's going to happen. I mean, this is just obvious. Well, the plane, because it's like a big glider, began to glide down. Now, it can't maneuver at all. Its defense is flying really, really high. And the plane began to glide down, and he got the engines restarted, but it's about 25,000 feet. And just then, the indicator for one of the brand new Soviet surface-to-air missiles, the SA-1 it's called, was on it. He picked it up, and the missile was on its way. And the thing about this missile, these are massive missiles. They look like a little bit taller than a telephone pole. And the whole goal of it is much like anti-aircraft artillery. If the plane's flying this way, they want the missile to come up and then explode and let the plane fly through the flak. As I move my hands around, I'm really showing nothing, but imagine the flak explodes and the plane flies through, and the pieces of metal, the shrapnel, flak from the German word, would knock the plane down. And that's what happened. He couldn't escape. The plane was hit. Now, the feeling was that the pilot wouldn't survive if they tried to bail out at 65,000 feet. And when they first made it, so this jet plane didn't have an ejector. You kind of need an ejector in a jet because if you just bail out, you get caught in the exhaust. So you need that ejector seat. And not only that, they gave every CIA pilot a pistol. It wasn't to defend themselves, it was to commit suicide. The thought was, you can't allow yourself to be captured because the United States has to deny these illegal operations. Well, as the plane was hit and the U-2 began to spiral around, somehow Francis Gary Powers got out of the cockpit, dislocated his shoulder. You can kind of see it slumped right here, and opened his parachute. He survived, somehow landed, and was literally captured. The story is by a couple Russian farmers with pitchforks. And you might say, wait a minute, he had a pistol. What's he going to do? You know, take me to Norway? He gave up. And he didn't want to die. He wanted to live. And so here is Khrushchev looking at the pieces of the U-2. And not only that, some of the film of the first pictures he took survived and intact. Khrushchev was furious and announced, we shot down an American spy plane. Now, Eisenhower administration immediately sent out a weather plane from Iran got lost, and we're sorry for the loss of the crew. You know, lied through their teeth. Well, when they brought out this, and then the pilot, it was clear that the United States plane got shot down, and the United States was humiliated. Eisenhower did something that is very weird to think about the president doing now. He took full responsibility for this and said that the president is responsible for flights like this, but he was infuriated at Dulles, thought he was let down. This will have a legacy about the president of the CIA giving disastrously false information, and this would happen time after time after time. But, and it destroyed the Paris summit. The Soviets were lenient. They gave Powers a 20-year prison sentence, and then would exchange him in East Berlin for, I think it was 38 people that the West had captured as spies. So, I jumped the gun there. So what happened, the big thing, I thought I had the slide there. What happened was the Paris summit, disaster. Nothing happened out of it. And the tension in the Cold War got bigger than ever before. From at a time where Khrushchev was going around looking at cows in the U.S. and going to Disneyland, the brand new Disneyland, to it looks like nuclear war. Both sides began testing weapons like mad. It wouldn't be long after this that the Soviets would explode a 50 megaton bomb, the Tsar bomb in Siberia. But while that's going on, Cuba, just 90 miles from the shore of the United States, was in the middle of a revolution. Now, the United States had always had this relationship with Cuba. The United States had eyed Cuba to take it from Spain as a colony, a slave colony in the 1850s. Remember the filibusters and that crew? And then the Spanish-American War, where the U.S. would pass the Platt Amendment, making Cuba essentially a protectorate, where we kept dictator after dictator. And Fiogoria, I always mispronounce his name, Batista, which is, there he is on Time magazine right here, was the brutal American-supported dictator of Cuba. Kept a horrible secret police. He was tied to organized crime. He was as corrupt as you could get. In fact, it would be under his administration that organized crime came into Havana and set up a bunch of casinos as kind of a playground for people in the on the East Coast to go and escape basically the laws and all things go. And so you had the mob connected. American businesses were cleaning up and paying virtually no taxes. Batista was getting rich, and the people of Cuba suffered. Education for most people was non-existent. Healthcare, you name it. And so there was a popular revolution led by a number of nationalists, but the leader was a confirmed socialist by the name of Fidel Castro, a lawyer, and he was the real deal. He was a revolutionary and would portray the image of the revolutionary for the rest of his life. The uniform, the beard, I mean, it had that revolutionary look. And there he is going into Havana when the Batista government collapsed. Well, Batista was so corrupt, even John Foster Dulles abandoned him in 56 and said, you got to reform. And even though the U.S. still sent aid, they started to look, maybe we could deal with Castro. And in 1959, Castro's tiny revolutionary army won a stunning victory, New Year's Day. A stunning victory. Batista's army just collapsed. The officers were corrupt, the men were being underpaid, and they just deserted. And overnight, Batista, who had a much bigger army, much better equipped, just fell apart. And Castro took power. And at first, the United States, First, the United States was hoping they could work with Castro, who set up a coalition government of all different people. The defining principle of Castro's first government was very nationalist. They wanted, remember the term land reform, to break up the land owned by the big landholders, especially American companies, and give it to peasants, to take back Cuban industry, especially mining, and make sure the money stays in Cuba. So basically try to do things for the Cubans. But he certainly was a socialist. And the United States tried to work with him, but after meeting with Nixon in 1959, he even appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, where Elvis first appeared on. I love, the revolutionary. I should add, his army never won one battle and won the war. That's the thing about guerrilla armies. Remember the thing I told you about the American Revolution. A guerrilla army, insurgency, doesn't need to win. They just need to survive and hold out. Doesn't mean it always works, but that's what they need to do, survive. Well, Nixon came out of this. Nixon, a rabid anti-communist, came out and for lots of reasons said Castro is a confirmed communist. We must stop him. And part of the reason was politically. He wanted to reinforce his, on the political spectrum, his right flank, the rabidly anti-communist elements in the United States, many Republicans and a lot of Democrats too. And so the United States in 1960 cut off aid to Cuba, said you're a communist and will not help them anymore. Well, by default, Castro thinking, oh, they're going to invade, just like the United States intervened time after time in big stick diplomacy, and he went to the only place they thought he could go, or he thought he could go. I think you know where this is going. To little kids with beards. Okay, that might be the greatest picture ever. This is in the United States, and all these kids dressed up as Castro. She's liking that a little bit too much. She, I think, has the proper attitude right there. But he's a communist, and you can see it in that picture. He went to Khrushchev. And Khrushchev began to aid this scene. What a great political coup for Khrushchev. Now he has an ally 90 miles from the United States shore. To his point of view, that's no different than when the United States has allies right on the Soviet border or close to it, like in Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, Japan, South Korea, Norway. That's the way he looked at it. Now, to the United States, this was totally unacceptable. And the United States began operations to overthrow Castro, trying to do the same thing they did in Guatemala. In fact, they began to practice and making a guerrilla army. And they hired a bunch of, this was a motley crew of people. And they began to train in, this might shock you, Guatemala, to invade Cuba. Trying to do the same thing in Guatemala, these CIA experts. By the way, one of the revolutionaries from Argentina, a doctor by the name of Che Guevara, would become internationally known for being a freedom fighter. He would eventually go to Africa and fight against colonialism. And then he would be killed probably, at least by the CIA in 1966. So Castro would go all the way well into the 2000s until cancer slowed him down and he eventually died a few years ago. But Castro, part of the reason he maintained power is he was able to say that I ousted ourselves from American control going back to the Platt Amendment. The Americans put in all these horrible dictators, and I kept them apart. And there he is with his younger brother, Raul, Raul meeting former President Obama. Well, once you're president, you're always president. So President Obama, and he's still in charge of Cuba today. The legacy of Cuba today, and it is a very complex one. I'll explain more in a little bit. But there's Raul. Everyone look at Raul. And you might wonder then, where did this man come from? Yes, Raul C. Calhoun. Do you see now where it comes from? Glasses, glasses, yes. Okay, so Cuba, U2, Cold War, election in 1960. So this is the first election where television is going to have a major impact, an image. And both candidates really thought they understood television. The Democrats, at their nominating convention, and it was actually a pretty contested, or could have been a pretty contested nomination, but they would pick a very young man. And he, well, in fact, returned to be the youngest man ever elected president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who was this guy of a very wealthy family who got rich off of finance and bootlegging, but he had almost unlimited source of money. He would be the first, well, actually, whoever would win this election would be the first president born in the 20th century. And so he really pushed this idea of something new, something different. And yet he was a veteran, a hero. He was a commander of a patrol boat called a PT boat. And they really pushed this with lots of pictures of his PT boat. And it was, the number of his PT boat was 109, so PT 109. And in fact, near Guadalcanal, I think off of Florida Island, his PT boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer, and he was horrifically hurt. His back, he never recovered from the back injury. He'd have to wear a very thick back brace and take a lot of painkillers because of his back. But he saved a couple members of his crew, was able to get help. So he was the real deal, a war hero. And so they really pushed that. The man for young America, for all America. I mean, they really pushed that. So the Democrats picked him. Now, the thing about Kennedy was elected to the House right after, using partially money from his dad, and then elected to the Senate as a very young man. And he had virtually no record. You might think, how could a guy not have any record for 12 years? Well, he was horrifically ill besides his back injury. It was unknown to most people, but he had Addison's disease, which made him weak, horrible headaches. He had lost weight. In fact, 3 different times in his life, 2 in the 1950s, he was administered last rites. Administered the last rites by a priest because they thought he was going to die. He's a fairly tall man, over 6 feet tall, and yet for a while there weighed only about 110 pounds. And so much of his career in the Senate, he was a non-entity. He was either ill and could not even go to the Senate, or when he was there, he was just kind of float in for a while and leave. He was known as a lightweight. He didn't really propose any major bills. He was liberal. He definitely believed in Keynesian economics. And so with that progressive element from Roosevelt, I should add that he would be much more liberal than anybody today. Well, much more liberal than either of the 2 people who are going to be running for president in this next election. But he had a very, so he didn't have much of a record, but that worked in his advantage. They could create an image for him. They could create it because he didn't have a record, because they knew his opponent had a huge record. They nominated the man who also could have been nominated for president, the Senate Majority Leader, and the second most powerful man in the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas. And people were shocked that he accepted the vice president's role, because vice presidents do nothing. They have 2 roles: break ties in the Senate and wait for the president to die. That's what we call foreshadowing. But he took the role. And so with that, it was always kind of an idea that if you're going to have a northerner, you should have a southerner. Today, that doesn't have near as much effect, but back then they really thought, if you have a southerner or northerner on a ticket, you got to balance it somehow. The Republicans nominated Richard Nixon, and Nixon was kind of a hybrid. He was very conservative, a rabid anti-communist, but not the fire-breathing conservatives on one end of the party. And so he was not quite as conservative as, let's say, future Republicans like Barry Goldwater or Ronald Reagan. But he was the rabid anti-communist, and he had the record. He made a name for himself with red baiting and fighting and attacking people that he would accuse of being communists, the Red Scare, as a member of the House and the Senate, and then he was vice president. And so he had this long record as opposed to Kennedy. Experience, and they really thought he knew how to use television. So this election looked like it was going to be an incredibly close election. And they also picked from Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. So they had to get a this was Nixon's from California, from Massachusetts, to get east-west. And so we have Johnson Kennedy. And what a race this is going to be. But now the Democrats can accuse the Republicans of being soft on communism. And you might remember the bomber gap. Well, what they did is they used the missile gap. They said that the Soviets have more long-range missiles that could fly over the Arctic and hit the United States in a half hour to 45 minutes, and there's nothing we could do about it. By the way, these missiles are called ICBMs. Military loves acronym, partially because they love the jargon, but also you don't have to spell it out. ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Intercontinental ballistic missiles. I thought I heard a siren outside. I thought they were going to take me away. I shouldn't have played that music. Shouldn't have played that music. And so this is actually an Atlas, one of the first American rockets. The U.S. did not focus on getting a satellite into space. They focused on ICBMs. And here's a model kit, a plastic model kit that you could buy in the 1970s. And I saw this model kit. I can remember it, or at least something very close like it, where you could make American and Soviet ICBMs. And who wouldn't want that? I agree. If you find this, you got to get it. You got to get it and make it for me. And the idea was that the Soviets, because of Sputnik, have now ahead and missiles will fly over and there's nothing the United States could do and we are doomed. And this would become the basis of, well, this would become very much like the bomber gap. That obviously the Soviets could do this, and the Republicans and the Eisenhower-Nixon administration, they did it to us. And the thing was, as it would turn out, there was a massive missile gap. A massive missile gap. The United States they were just making the first ICBMs. It's called the Titan I and Titan II missiles, which had liquid fuel, incredibly dangerous. One exploded in a silo in Arkansas in the late 1970s and killed most of the bomber crew, the silo crew, and nearly blew up the warhead. Wow. And they could carry a 10 to 20 megaton nuclear weapon. And the United States already had 100 of these by the election of 1960. But that's not all. The United States had hundreds of Atlas, Thor, and Jupiter missiles. And these were called intermediate or medium range missiles. IRBMs, MRBMs. And those were in bases in Turkey, Italy, and Japan. And they could reach most places in the Soviet Union too. And the United States had over 1,000 heavy bombers, including B-52 bombers that could fly from bases at, let's say, Ellsworth Air Force Base in Rapid City, South Dakota, and bomb virtually every place in the Soviet Union. The Soviets, the number of missiles they had were on election day. Are you ready for it? Are you ready for the number? The number is 1. And not only was it 1, it took them 2 days to fuel the missile because the fuel was so volatile. So it was a pretty much worthless weapon. And it was a huge missile gap. But nobody in the United States knew it, and they believed what the Democrats said. Eisenhower knew it wasn't true, and Nixon almost certainly did too, because of the U-2 flights. But they couldn't say anything because of how secret they were and the embarrassment of the U-2 being shot down. So this ICBMs, I can't even begin to tell you what a big deal it was. President Reagan would do the same thing in 1980. Well, then it would be Governor Reagan running for president, and call it the window of vulnerability. This great scheme. We'll see the same thing with mean, trying to make Iraq into this huge power, which, man, nothing. But that's another story. But another thing happened in this election was this. The first ever debates between presidents would take place in 1960. And this had never happened before between presidential candidates. You should remember, though, that it'd be into the 20th century that candidates really begin to campaign for themselves. Most of this done with newspapers or surrogates for the candidate. But because of TV, Kennedy challenged Nixon to a series of debates. And Nixon had been doing this 50-state campaign, but he was experienced. He came to the Congress and the Senate at the same time as Kennedy. In fact, they kind of looked at each other as friends, about the same age. And he did kind of a little stint as a staff officer in the Navy. Kennedy was in combat in the Navy, but they saw themselves as kind of close to each other. But Nixon really thought he would just destroy Kennedy. He had the experience, he was the debater, and Kennedy they saw as kind of a pretty boy and a lightweight. That was his reputation. And no way he could stand up to Richard Nixon, who was a formidable intellect and an evil man. Part of the thing Nixon was trying to do is Nixon had this reputation as being a trickster, and I told you before, his nickname was Tricky Dick. And so they made a big deal about Nixon trying to kind of the new Nixon, and was all that stuff about him being a trickster and playing and dishonest and duplicitous. That was a lie and a myth, and this is who he really is. By the way, in '68, there'd be the new Nixon, and then after he resigned as president, there'd be the new Nixon. Always trying to rehabilitate this man. Nixon was a seething pool of resentment and anger against other people. And this would come out in ways of just intense paranoia. So back to the debate. So this will be televised. So let's watch a little bit of this. This is from the PBS series they did on Nixon. And so it's a little bit about Nixon, but does such a great job and just enough to give you an idea about the debate. So.
Richard Nixon stood at the top of his party. As he mapped out an ambitious 50-state campaign, he was challenged by his opponent, John F. Kennedy, to a series of televised debates, the first in American history. Even when hospitalized for 2 weeks with a knee injury, Nixon remained confident, anxious for the debates to begin, eager once again to use television to talk directly to the voters.
At the time, there was a feeling that this overall might be a mismatch. Nixon was the candidate who had more prominence, who had been a member of the House, a member of the Senate, and the Vice President of the United States. Kennedy, he didn't have a particularly strong reputation in Congress. There was some feeling that he was, to some extent, a playboy, but he wasn't too serious a senator. So I think people felt that Nixon had the edge, and I think Nixon felt that he had the edge.
So, a couple things about this. First off, remember I told you how sick Kennedy was? Well, in the late 1950s, he got a new doctor, and this doctor got him on a series of injections to try to get him through, well, first off, just to make him feel better. And the injections involved a whole cocktail of various types of things. Some of the bigger were steroids. And with steroids, he would start to gain weight again and just feel stronger and better, even though there's a lot of side effects of that. And as would turn out later, a lot of amphetamines. A lot of amphetamines. And so that was part of the issue about how he was able to get through this. In fact, the doctor that subscribed to Kennedy was nicknamed Dr. Feelgood. I cannot make that up. But back to this then. So that's how Kennedy survived this. So Kennedy is out there traveling around the country, and he's going to the most important states. Well, Nixon's trying to go to every state. But Nixon was in the hospital. He lost weight. He was gaunt. He was pale. While Kennedy had been out in the sun, he looked fit. And there's something else. You might notice the suits right here. The style of suit for the time, the popular suit, was gray. A gray suit or tan suit was the style. Kennedy wore an unusual suit, dark suit, and a red tie. And he understood something that the Nixon people didn't realize. On TV, the gray suit, combined with his very pale face, makes him look very bland. And he almost blends in like he's invisible in this screen right behind. People talked about his floating head, it looked like. Where you notice how Kennedy comes out and it's very contrast. You can see him. Your eyes are immediately drawn to Kennedy. I mean, everyone looking at that screen right now, you're drawn to Kennedy. And you notice today, what do politicians wear, at least male politicians? Dark suit, dark tie. In fact, it's almost always dark suit, red tie. That's what he wore there. A couple other things too. Both men said no makeup. No makeup. Men don't wear makeup. So no makeup. But Kennedy, they snuck him into the bathroom and put a little makeup on because the camera catches every blemish. And so they put makeup on. Nixon, on the other hand, he was one of those guys who's already pale, but he just had a beard. His whiskers grew really fast. In fact, he had a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. The joke was he grunted full beard. And so they would shave him, but it would start to come out a little bit, and they're worried how that would look, especially on the pale face on camera. So instead of putting makeup, they put this thing called shave stick on him. So think about it, look like a stick deodorant. So if you think a stick deodorant, or like a roll-on deodorant, I'm sorry, which aren't sold as much anymore, but in it was a product that would actually eat away at hair. So it's this really nasty chemical. There's a product called Nair. Some of you might have heard of it. It does something similar to like leg hair. But they smeared this stuff on, and I guess it just stunk. But the whole idea was to keep this off. Keep off his shadow so he didn't have that kind of shadow coming out that would make him even look worse. Yet, you can see from that, you can still kind of see the shadow. And so he has this cream on him. And the other thing is that in old television studios had to have a lot of light because the cameras couldn't pick up that much light. And modern cameras are better, but still, if you ever go watch the taping of a television show, there are lights everywhere. Lights are hot. That's why I was talking about the hot light of television. And so that's why they keep, like, for example, you watch a taping of a talk show or something, they keep the studio as cold as possible because they don't want everyone to sweat. Well, Nixon sweated like that. And so they knew he was probably going to sweat, and they're worried about the 5 o'clock shadow. Well, what happened was the shave stick on his face began to, it was still there, the smearing on. And then when he started to sweat, it started to drip down his face, and then glop started going on his shirt. You could see it. I mean, people called up their local television station and said, "Oh my God, the man is dying. Do something." Reporters afterwards said that Nixon looked like a sinister chipmunk on television. This debate would be deadly.
The candidates need no introduction. The Republican candidate, Vice President Richard M. Nixon, and the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy. According to rules set by the candidates themselves, each man should...
The Nixon-Kennedy debates would forever change the way Americans chose their presidents. Political rallies and old-fashioned handshaking became much less important than the image on the television screen.
You must understand that Nixon himself had said, "I don't want any makeup on for these particular debates." What I tried to explain to Dick was he has a certain characteristics of his skin where it's almost transparent. And it was a very nice thought to say, you know, I don't want any makeup, but that he really needed it in order to have what we would call even an acceptable television picture. And of course, JFK, here he'd been riding in motorcades all over California with the top down. He looked like a bronze warrior when he came into Chicago. He really did.
Mr. Nixon comes out of the Republican Party. He was nominated by it. And it is a fact that through most of these last 25 years, the Republican leadership has opposed federal aid for education, medical care for the aged.
I know what it means to be poor. I know what it means to see people who are unemployed. I know Senator Kennedy feels as deeply about these problems as I do. But our disagreement is not about the goals for America, but only about the means to reach those goals.
The first debate was costly to Nixon. The radio audience thought he had won, but the largest television audience in history had seen the vice president haggard and drawn, and had been given its first sustained look at the Kennedy style.
Kennedy had a great charm for not only the voters, but also for the press. Okay,
I'm going to stop it right there. So this was deadly. Now, the television audience overwhelmingly thought Kennedy won, because on TV, it's image. Now, the radio audience, actually, it was basically a tie. Nixon might have won slightly. But Kennedy won the debate, and that image would be for the rest of the campaign of Kennedy as this, very charming, man who people looked at and said, that's the person I want to be president. And he looked healthful. He looked like young, fit, vigorous man. Lots of pictures of him playing touch football or sailing. The thing was, he was incredibly ill on a cocktail of drugs and was in pain all the time and involved in very dangerous behavior. But that doesn't matter. That wasn't the image they want. And you see presidents to this very day are able to portray an image despite of what they really do. It's not so much of what the candidate is or who or what they believe in or what they do, what kind of person they are. It's can they meet the image that voters, especially the voters that decide elections, can they meet that image that they want to see, that they want in a president? They don't have to be it. Can they meet the image? And that's what television and now the screen does when you look on the YouTubes or whatever it might be. So with that, a couple more things in. Also the first major television ads. And we're not going to do the Nixon's ads, I showed you a few, but the ads have changed dramatically. Let's look at one ad and see how this one works. I got to put my earphone in so I don't make too much noise. I wonder what ad this will be. Oh. Okay, you want an earphone.
Kennedy, 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 for me. Kennedy, 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 Kennedy.
Do you want a man for president who's seasoned through and through, but not so doggone seasoned that he won't try something new?
Whatever
a
that
man
means.
who's old enough to know
And young enough to do.
Well, it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you.
But it's Kennedy, 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 for me. Kennedy, Kennedy.
By the way, I would argue this ad is shockingly
Do you
annoying,
want a
and
man
you
with spirit
cannot
who
go
is
away
not afraid
without
to
thinking
fight?
about this.
A man whose record shows that he will fight for what
And
is
we need another commercial. We need a palate cleanser, so to speak.
Fight for president, fight for
Ah, you knew I had to play it.
Fight for president, you like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington.
Okay, so when the election came out, it was a razor-thin margin, as you can see from this. Look how close it was. So the electoral vote, okay, remember that's the one that matters, 303 to 219. By the way, you also notice two brand new states, Alaska and Hawaii, came in to the Union. They were both territories of the United States. Well, the U.S. bought the claim from Russia in 1867. The U.S. Got rid of an independent monarchy and replaced it with, remember, Sanford Dole and all that, and annexed it in 1898. But they're both in the Union. And you'll notice Nixon winning here. Kennedy, though, the blue states, the Solid South was with him, but some states in the Solid South were going away because of Kennedy's support for civil rights. And Kennedy came out with this. And you should see that the popular vote, though, look how close it was. Only 120,000 votes separated the two, which is nothing. That is almost a statistical error. And just a few votes differently, and especially Illinois, and you might have a different president. And the Kennedy people claimed that the Nixon people were stuffing ballots in southern Illinois. The Nixon people claimed that the Kennedy people were stuffing ballots in Chicago. The answer is, yeah, it could be. By the way, Texas, of course, that's Lyndon Johnson's state, so that's what it went there. But you also notice one more thing. You see them voting for Harry Byrd. These 10 electors. Harry Byrd was not on the ballot, but he was a segregationist senator from Virginia, and they voted for him as an anti-civil rights civil rights candidate. They probably would have voted for Kennedy because he wasn't a Republican, at least at that time, if the vote would have been closer. But still, that gives you an idea that the Solid South that we already saw in 1948 is beginning to chip away. And by the end of the decade, the Republicans, and they'll call it the Southern Strategy, will be the party against civil rights to get white Southern voters who used to be Democrats, which we see, which would make the Republican Party today, it's a Southern party. Southern. And yeah. But, where are we at here? Okay. So, last thing. When Eisenhower left office, he was so worried that the Cold War, he wanted to be the peacemaker, and the Cold War was going to be worse than he thought. And so in his farewell address, he would make an announcement. And farewell address, for the most part, this comes from the president from Washington, where he warned against parties and foreign entanglements war. Eisenhower, seeing that a lot of this has come through, he warned against the growing strength of what he called the military-industrial complex, a cabal of military leaders who want more power by having a bigger army, and industrial leaders, the big arms manufacturers who are going to make a lot of money selling the arms race, that they will increase or exaggerate the outside threat, for example, the Soviet Union, to make money, and that will get the United States into more wars, and he honestly believed would threaten American democracy, where the U.S. will be involved in war after war after war, like, for example, the U.S. has been in war after war after war your entire life. We've been at war. And this would destroy democracy. So we're going to watch just a little bit of this speech.
Of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
So he was actually very scared about this. And of course, you know what's going to come out of this. He was completely ignored. So that cabal of military and arms manufacturers, and they would exaggerate the Soviet threat, just as other threats, like, let me throw one out here, Osama bin Laden, terrorists, Saddam Hussein. And by exaggerating the threat, that will mean a weird combination of power, of defense in the military, and money will be more war and the end of the Republic. That's what he was terrified of. So, the end of the Republic. Would he be listened to? No. The greatest peacetime military buildup in American history would take place under John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He'd be surpassed dramatically by Ronald Reagan, but that's another story. And on that note, that's where I'm going to quit. So, covered a lot today. I love the debate. I love this era in history. And so I love this era in history. It's one of my favorite times in history. And I'm going to, okay, tomorrow about the same time, I've decided if I do want to watch part of the video, but I'm going to watch it with you if everything goes right. And we might have to do this on, I might have to watch it on Teams, and I'll let you know, and then I'll try to figure it out. But I have the copy on YouTube, so I think it'll work. But it's called The Rage Within. And we're going to watch it either tomorrow or Friday. But it fits in with the 50s, and so it'll be a worksheet. I'll make that do. And it's the best thing I have on civil rights in that era. It's the best I've ever seen. 40 minutes on civil rights. And so on that note, if there's no questions, I am going to go, and I'll leave with a little bit of Little Richard.